How's it going, everyone? Before here, welcome to Heliopolis Radio. Apologies for the nose scratching there. As you can hear from my voice, I'm sick and I have a flu. So we're not all there, but we're gonna go ahead with it anyway. And we're gonna be continuing on with the energy centers, more specifically the chakras and their link to addiction. And so in the last podcast, I spent a whole episode talking about the heart chakra or the heart space in a very new age sense. Again, before I have to get into it, I'm really giving the most basic fundamental rundown of it. There's much more depth and intensity to the chakra system. It's a very ancient, it's a well-established energetic science that is much older than, it even predates most religious practices that we know of today. So what I'm talking about is very down-to-earth, grounded, almost new age, as much as I hate to say it. But this is the only way I can relay this information without sounding like a complete lunatic or so I'm just going to try and put it in a simpler way as possible. So the next center that moves past the heart chakra is the Vishuddhi, also known as the throat chakra, which is the center of expression. And then you have the Ajna, 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 which actually is also typically described as the third eye. And so the reason why I've decided to bunch those two together is because they're very well interlinked. That's where, in terms of the chakra science, that's when we tap into the nature of the mind. The mind begins to establish itself from this upper realm. And so while the throat chakra is a means of it's a means of expression and creation, it's where we transmit and receive sound. At least in the chakra science, it's associated with those things. And it's the bridge between literally your mind and your body. So think of it as a bridge between your upper self and your lower self type thing. And so it's very integral, right? It's the bridge between communication. It links everything. And so in terms of the third eye or the ajna, it's basically where we have a holistic sense of ourselves, where the mind typically resides. It's our method of perception, how we perceive things, and not only how we perceive things, but how we process them and how we react, essentially. And more specifically, it's our ideas, our thought processes, and our understanding of ourselves and things around us as they are. And so in terms of addiction, without getting too esoteric and lost in the whole, transcendent side of things, it's important because at the end of the day, everything comes to the mind, right? And also it comes down to our ability to understand and express what's on our mind without in the right way, right? And in a way that is truthful to us and truthful to those around us. And so in terms of how we go about addiction, our mind processes everything that goes on in our bodies, and it registers them and it reacts accordingly. And a lot of our actions tend to be ingrained thought patterns that the mind has simply cultivated through consistent exposure to things. And so you see a lot of self-help people tend to promote the idea of, your thoughts create your reality and blah, 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 and all sorts of things like that. And there's actually an element of strong truth to that, because really what it comes down to is our mind is how it's what ultimately cultivates us as a whole. Yes, we have our own compulsions, we have our survival mechanisms, we have our sexual mechanisms, we have our egoic mechanisms, our lower ego, we have our heart space, and we have the way we talk, but ultimately it all comes down to the mind. And so how addiction kind of lodges its way is the repetitive nature of addictive habits and behaviors, right? When our mind becomes accustomed to a certain way, it's hard for us to shift that thinking process. Our brain wires itself according to all our inherent learned behaviors and responses. And so when addiction becomes a fundamental part of who we are, whether we like it or not, it eventually gets to our head, it gets to our mind. And that's where truly the most difficult aspect is, because once something's in your head, unless you're a gifted individual, it's really hard to get those things out because, you know, everything we do is to establish some type of equilibrium or sense of balance and functionality. So that's all the mind is predominantly ever focused on, is maintaining whatever it can to be balanced, even if that the maintenance of that balance is destructive and dangerous. Hence why, you know, addiction is quite the battle in of itself. And, you know, I remember this weird video that I watched. Shit, I wish I had a bit sharper memory. But yeah, they were talking about how, you know, the consumption of pornographic material, what it does with our dopamine neural pathways, and how our mind has essentially, it has to rewire itself and adjust itself to the change in brain chemistry that the exposure to porn does. And again, I'm no scientist, just a random brother just spitting some shit about how he's kind of, you know, but anyway, I'm not gonna get into that. And so yeah, it's really important because, you know, once something lodges itself into the mind, it's quite a difficult battle in that sense. You know, if it's a temporary thing, you know, if you're just responding to a temporary emotional stimuli or a tough situation and it's just a momentary compulsion and it hasn't got into your head, like your headspace is still good, you may have just slipped up a little, then I feel like addiction is way, way easier to handle and it's less likely to happen. But once it gets to your head and once it becomes your mind's way of coping with life as a whole, then you really have to look and investigate yourself. And, you know, the detoxing process is much more intensive because it's not just of the body, it's of the mind, it's of the brain. It's completely redeveloping yourself. And I think, you know, that's where it becomes how likely you are to recover and overcome, or how likely you are to fall back and stay stuck in the space. And, you know, it's a gamble of time type thing, because the more your mind reinforces the behavior, the more difficult it is to really recover from it. And when I look at myself, and our generation, my generation, you know, most of us have been exposed to addictive behaviors for at least, I would estimate, maybe 10 or more years plus. It could be anything. It could be porn, it could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be whatever, you know, type of, and I don't want to term it destructive behavior because that's a very subjective thing. To someone, it may just be a fundamental part of this thing we call life, and that's also good. You know, but I doubt very, very few people have that type of maturity or intellectual sobriety to live in that type of thinking. So for most people, we've been exposed to very destructive patterns for predominantly most of our childhood and teenagehood and even into our adult years. But when we're adults, we're more conscious, and ultimately we are kind of more responsible for ourselves in that sense. But you can think about how hard it is just to change your behavior, how to handle addiction, because the withdrawal is so painful. You know, when it's in your mind, there's a certain degree of pain that comes with changing and trying to move away from addiction. It's not just your body temporarily detoxing, it's your mind changing the way it thinks and behaves. And that process is extremely difficult and painful. And so when it comes to, you know, this ajna or your third eye, it's really about really doing that. You know, they talk about meditation, and what really, in my opinion, what meditation is an evaluation of your thought patterns and your ideas and exactly how you go about your fucking business in this life, right? How you handle things and literally what you do to maintain your balance, right? And then in terms of the Vishwadi, because I didn't want to just kind of skip out on it because it's really important, what it actually represents is truth. It's truth. It's how authentic you are with truth. And truth means you see, you recognize the nature of things and you relay that in an honest way. A lot of us, we perceive things in a true sense, but we never say it in a truly, you know, we always shifted, we manipulated. But to be honest, and it's not also just about being truthful with people outside of you. It's not about how you transmit truth. You know, if you tell someone to fuck off and you honestly mean it, or you tell someone you love them and you honestly mean it, you're not lying about it. It's also about the truth in how you see yourself. That's a major part of the Vishwadi, is the truth of your own inner state of beings, your own inner state of affairs. How honest are you? What's your dialogue with yourself? How much do you essentially, how much of a practice do you have where you sit and you evaluate your own inner state of mind, your own behaviors, and how real and raw are you with that process? And that's different for everyone. But in terms of addiction, there's always a type of manipulation and distortion that happens at the level here. And so ultimately, those two centers are very important because it's about truth. And it's about not only truth, it's the truth of the way that you behave and the way you perceive and the way you conduct yourself, right? So, I hope there's a whole different dimension to what the chakras represent in terms of creative capability and destructive capability. But in an addictive sense, in a basic sense, it's the ideas, the themes, the patterns, the tendencies that are associated with those type of energy centers, which is what I'm talking about. And those tendencies are what you tend to correlate with addiction and everything like that. So, it's important, I guess. I'm trying to keep this podcast below 50 minutes. Last one was a bit too long. When it comes to that, it's what I've learned with myself is it's really working with your thought patterns, ingrained behaviors that have been reinforced in a neurological sense over a long period of time. And most people who study brain and behavior and psychology, they won't understand exactly what I'm talking about, and how you can essentially, you're never too old to start changing. It's maybe a different, steeper climb and a much harder climb, but the brain is capable of that. And more importantly, if you couple changing your minds and your ideas, and you supplement that with a physical regimen to handle your compulsions, because not everything can just be, very few people have the unique ability to just get things going with their head alone. A lot of us, we need the grounding, we need the action, you need that raw dirt, you need the mud a bit, you need to kind of grind it out, right? So again, this is not a prescription, this is not even telling people how to handle this shit, but it's interesting, you can use this as a blueprint to evaluate yourself. I do it myself. And it's a battle. Hey, it's an honest battle. I almost I almost had a relapse just literally 2 days ago, and it's brutal, right? It's just the rawness of this entire thing, and so it's just recognizing the energetic nature of your being, not just the energetic nature of your being, because a lot of people don't believe in any of that stuff, and 100% okay with it. If you're not aligned with it, then think of it as your compulsions and your tendencies that happen at lower high levels. We have lower behaviors and we have higher behaviors. The mind being considerably a higher behavior, if you'd want to put it that way. It's important to psychologically evaluate yourself and how your mind behaves. Meditate on that or do some evaluation in terms of your truth. Very few people are authentic with that truth, myself included. To be truthful is a very difficult thing in a world which is so easily tainted by lies, right? And not necessarily because lies are people are lying for malicious, malevolent ends, but they're lying simply because, being truthful is just not as conducive as it would be. That's just the nature of society we live in, but I'm not going to get into that too much. The gist of it, the summary of it is that you have your Vishuddhi, which is your truth center. It's where it's your means of expression. It's the transmission of sound and interpretation of it. You have your Ajna, which is essentially about, conceptually, it's about ideas. It's about your mind. It's about your thinking processes. It's your faculties of awareness. It's how your mind behaves and reacts in certain situations. And addiction ultimately affects us on every level of our being. It's always good when we handle addiction when it's at its most compulsive state, because it's easier to deal with. If your body has been temporarily poisoned, you detoxify your body, and then it doesn't need to be anything deeper than that. But once addiction has been a learned behavior, it becomes much, much more ingrained in higher aspects of our functioning. Higher chakras get affected, and once it gets to the mind, that's when it's a bit more, this flew. Once it gets to the mind, it's a bit more difficult to handle. It's actually where it's at its most, I guess, deep conditioning, where it's most potent. So again, for those of you that are mind-orientated and truth-orientated people, I hope you found this useful. And I'll catch you in the next podcast hopefully with a better voice and no flu. But thank you for tuning in. Peace and blessings to the people. Thank you.